her. Perhaps, Slack agreed. In the meantime, I've had an interesting report from London regarding Mr. Carmichael. It seems he wasn't only an art dealer with expertise in provenance, he was also something of an amateur genealogist, with a particular interest in cases where inheritance lines were disputed or unclear. Miss Marple's ears pricked up at this information. Inheritance lines? Did your report mention whether Mr. Carmichael had been researching the Hargreaves family specifically? As a matter of fact, it did. He had been making inquiries about the descendants of Sir George Hargreaves, focusing on a period shortly after Emma Marchmont's death, when Sir George was briefly abroad. Something about birth records in France. Mrs. Hargreaves paled visibly. France? I don't understand. What would French birth records have to do with our family history? I intend to find out, Slack assured her. I've requested copies of the documents Carmichael was examining. They should arrive tomorrow. As Miss Marple prepared to leave Thornfield House, her mind busy with these new developments, she encountered Madame Valenska in the entrance hall, her exotic appearance somewhat subdued, her manner hesitant. Miss Marple, may I have a word? In private. They stepped into a small anteroom, and Madame Valenska closed the door carefully behind them. When she turned back, her demeanor had changed subtly, the theatrical aspects of her personality falling away to reveal a more direct, intelligent gaze. I haven't been entirely honest with you, she said, without preamble. I am not actually a medium, though I have some sensitivity to atmospheres and impressions. My real name is Margaret Vance, and I am a distant relation of Emma Marchmont. I suspected something of the sort, Miss Marple replied calmly. Your knowledge of Emma's story seemed too detailed for mere research. Yes, well, Emma was my great-grandmother's cousin. Family history remembers her as a brilliant, passionate woman who was cruelly used and then discarded. I've spent years trying to piece together the true circumstances of her death. You believe she was murdered? Miss Marple stated, rather than asked. Margaret nodded. I do. The suicide narrative never rang true to me. Emma was not the type to take her own life, no matter how desperate her circumstances, and certain details about her death were suspicious. Such as? The laudanum bottle found beside her was a brand she was known to despise. Her last letter to my great-grandmother, sent just days before her death, spoke of a plan to force her lover to acknowledge their relationship. Hardly the words of a woman contemplating suicide. And there were rumors of a visitor to Thornfield House the night she died. A woman, not a man. These details added yet another dimension to the historical mystery that seemed entwined with the present-day crimes. As Miss Marple bade farewell to Margaret Vance and made her way back to her lodgings, she felt that the disparate threads of the case were beginning to form a pattern of deception spanning generations, where the past and present were connected by secrets worth killing to protect. And at the center of it all stood the Victorian mirror, silent witness to both past and present tragedies, its reflective surface concealing more than it revealed. Miss Marple was convinced that Emma Marchmont's missing diary held the key to understanding both her death and the attacks on Richard Carmichael and Letitia Blackwood. The diary was hidden, where only G would think to look, but where would that be, after all these years? As darkness fell, Miss Marple sat by her window, gazing out at the silhouette of Thornfield House visible on the distant hillside. Somewhere within those walls, she felt certain, lay the answer to both the historical mystery and the present danger, and someone in that house was willing to kill to ensure those answers remained hidden. Chapter 5: The Truth in the Glass. The hospital corridor was quieter in the evening hours, the harsh fluorescent lighting softened somewhat by the approaching night. Miss Marple sat beside Miss Blackwood's bed, observing the pale, drawn face of Mrs. Hargreaves' companion with compassionate attention. Though still weak, Miss Blackwood had regained consciousness and was now able to speak, albeit in a voice barely above a whisper. It was terrible, she murmured, her eyes darting nervously around the room, as though expecting to see something frightening materialize from the shadows. I went downstairs to fetch a book I'd left in the drawing room. I didn't want to go in there, not after what happened to poor Mr. Carmichael, but I needed that book. Of course, Miss Marple said soothingly. What time was this? Just after 11. The house was quiet. Mrs. Hargreaves had retired early, and the staff had gone to their quarters. Miss Blackwood's fingers plucked restlessly at the hospital blanket. The drawing room was dark, but I didn't want to turn on all the lights and draw attention. I used just the small lamp by the doorway. And then, Miss Marple prompted gently when Miss Blackwood fell silent. I found my book on the side table, but as I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of a movement in the mirror. Just a shadow at first, but then, her voice faltered. Then I saw her face, superimposed over my own reflection. A beautiful, sad face with such accusing eyes. And she spoke, or at least I thought she did. The words seemed to form in my mind rather than in my ears. What did she say? He knows where it is hidden. He has always known. Miss Blackwood shuddered. I was so frightened I couldn't move. And then the face changed, became distorted, and I felt suddenly dizzy. I remember reaching for the telephone, calling you, and then nothing more until I woke up here. Inspector Slack, who had been standing silently at the foot of the bed, spoke up. Miss Blackwood, the doctors have found traces of a poison in your system, derived from a plant called monkshood. It caused hallucinations and then unconsciousness. You were very fortunate the dose wasn't larger. Miss Blackwood's eyes widened. Poison? But how? I had dinner early, alone in my room. I didn't eat or drink anything after that except... She paused, her brow furrowing. Except for a cup of tea that James brought me around 10 o'clock. He said Mrs. Hargreaves thought I looked tired at dinner and had asked him to bring it to me. Something to help me sleep. Miss Marple and Inspector Slack exchanged significant glances. Did you notice anything unusual about the tea? Slack asked. An odd taste or smell? It was quite bitter, but James said Mrs. Hargreaves had added a special herbal blend she finds soothing. I thought nothing of it at the time. And this was about an hour before you went downstairs and saw the face in the mirror, Miss Marple clarified. Yes, exactly. Miss Blackwood's expression turned from confusion to dawning horror. You don't think James wouldn't have... We're investigating all possibilities, Slack said neutrally. Now, there's something else we need to ask you about. Before these events, had you discovered anything unusual about the Victorian mirror, or about Mr. Carmichael's interest in it? Miss Blackwood hesitated, her fingers continuing their restless movement on the blanket. I did overhear something the day of the dinner party. I was arranging flowers in the hallway outside the library when Mr. Carmichael arrived early. James was showing him in, and they seemed to know each other quite well, better than James had suggested to Mrs. Hargreaves. In what way? Miss Marple inquired. They were discussing some documentation Mr. Carmichael had found, something about a marriage certificate and birth records from France. Mr. Carmichael said it changed everything about the inheritance line, and James seemed very agitated. He said they needed to speak privately before the other guests arrived. Did you hear anything more? No, they went into the library and closed the door. But later, just before dinner, I saw James in the glasshouse, picking leaves from one of the plants. I thought it strange at the time, as he's never shown any interest in gardening. This new information was precisely what Miss Marple had suspected, a connection between James Hargreaves, Mr. Carmichael, and the poisonous plant that had been used in both attacks. But what was the documentation they had discussed, and how did it relate to the inheritance line? After leaving Miss Blackwood to rest, Miss Marple and Inspector Slack conferred in a quiet corner of the hospital corridor. It seems we may have our poisoner, Slack said grimly, though motive remains unclear. Why would Hargreaves want to silence both Carmichael and Miss Blackwood? I believe the answer lies in whatever documents Mr. Carmichael discovered, Miss Marple replied. Miss Blackwood mentioned marriage certificates and birth records from France, possibly relating to Emma Marchmont's child, referenced in the letter we found. If such documents exist, they might indeed change everything about the inheritance line, as Mr. Carmichael reportedly said. You think Emma Marchmont's child survived? Slack looked skeptical. After all this time, what possible relevance could that have to current inheritances? That depends, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, on the legal status of that child. If Emma and Sir George were secretly married, as the documents might suggest, their child would have been legitimate, and the rightful heir to the Hargreaves' fortune and properties. Slack's expression shifted as he grasped the implications. And that child's descendants would have a claim that superseded the current family line. Precisely, a claim that might be worth killing to suppress. The following morning found Miss Marple once again at Thornfield House, where she discovered Margaret Vance, formerly Madame Valenska, engaged in earnest conversation with Mrs. Hargreaves in the morning room. "Jane," Mrs. Hargreaves greeted her with evident relief. "I'm so glad you're here. Margaret has been telling me the most extraordinary things about her family connection to Emma Marchmont." "Indeed." Miss Marple took a seat, noting the paper spread across the table between the two women. "My grandmother kept certain family documents," Margaret explained. "Letters from Emma to her cousin, my great-grandmother, and some newspaper clippings that were never made public. They suggest that Emma was not only expecting a child when she died, but that she might have secretly married her lover abroad." "In France, perhaps," Miss Marple suggested, recalling Miss Blackwood's overheard conversation. Margaret looked surprised. "Yes, exactly. How did you know?" "It was something Mr. Carmichael had been investigating before his death. Do your family documents include any actual proof of this marriage?" "Unfortunately, no. Only references in Emma's letters to our time in Paris and the promises made and solemnized there. But if Mr. Carmichael found official records—" Margaret's voice trailed off as the implication sank in. Mrs. Hargreaves, who had been listening intently, spoke up. "If Emma was legally married to Sir George and their child survived, then everything we thought we knew about the Hargreaves' inheritance would be wrong. James wouldn't be the legitimate heir at all." "And who would be?" Miss Marple asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Margaret met her gaze steadily. "According to my family history, Emma's child, a daughter, was taken by a nurse to relatives in France after Emma's death. She was raised as Marguerite Vaillant, never knowing her true parentage. She was my grandmother." The silence that followed this revelation was broken by the arrival of Inspector Slack, accompanied by a constable carrying a manila envelope. "Mrs. Hargreaves," Slack nodded curtly. "Miss Marple, and—" He glanced at Margaret with raised eyebrows. "Margaret Vance," Miss Marple supplied. "A descendant of Emma Marchmont, as it happens." Slack's eyebrows rose further. "Is that so?" "Most convenient timing, Miss Vance." "Inspector," Mrs. Hargreaves intervened, "Margaret has been sharing some family documents that support the theory that Emma Marchmont was secretly married to Sir George Hargreaves." "Then she'll be interested in these," Slack said, gesturing for the constable to place the envelope on the table. "The documents Mr. Carmichael was researching just arrived from London, certified copies of records from the British Embassy in Paris, dated January 1887. With careful hands, Slack extracted several papers from the envelope. A marriage certificate for George William Hargreaves and Emma Margaret Marchmont, performed at the British Embassy in Paris on January 12, 1887, and a birth registration, dated September 30th, 1887, for a female child born to Marguerite Vaillant, noted as being the alias used by Emma Marchmont after her return to England. "September," Mrs. Hargreaves repeated, "but Emma died in April." "The child was born posthumously," Margaret said softly, "delivered by cesarean section after Emma's death, according to my family history. It was kept secret to protect the child from those who had arranged Emma's death." "Murder, not suicide," Miss Marple murmured, "as you suspected." "These documents," Slack continued, "were filed confidentially at the time but remain legal records. Mr. Carmichael apparently traced them through his genealogical research." "And told James what he had found," Miss Marple added, not realizing the dangerous position this placed him in. "We've issued a warrant for James Hargreaves' arrest," Slack informed them. "Unfortunately, he appears to have left Thornfield House sometime during the night. My men are searching for him now." As Slack departed to coordinate the search, Mrs. Hargreaves turned to Margaret with a dazed expression. "If what these documents show is true, then you, not James, are the rightful heir to the Hargreaves estate." "I didn't come here seeking an inheritance," Margaret assured her. "I came to learn the truth about Emma's death and to clear her name from the stigma of suicide. But now it seems the past and present are more entangled than any of us realized." Miss Marple, who had been quietly contemplating the documents, spoke up. "There's still one piece missing from this puzzle. Emma's diary, which she mentioned in her letter to Sir George. If it contains the full truth of their relationship, as she claimed, it might also reveal who was responsible for her death." "And where it might be hidden," Mrs. Hargreaves added. "She said it was where only G would think to look, but after all these years and with the house so changed—" Perhaps not so changed in the ways that matter, Miss Marple said, thoughtfully. Miss Marchmont specified that the hiding place was one that only Sir George would know. It would need to be somewhere personal to them both, a place with shared significance. Margaret's eyes widened suddenly. The mirror. In her letter, Emma wrote that it was a gift from Sir George. What if the diary is hidden within the mirror itself, not just the letter? The three women hurried to the drawing room, where the Victorian mirror had been reassembled and returned to its place on the wall after the discovery of Emma's letter. It gleamed in the morning light, its ornate frame and slightly distorted glass unchanged by the passage of years. We examined the back panel thoroughly, Miss Marple said, studying the mirror with fresh eyes. The compartment contained only the letter. But what about the glass itself? Margaret suggested. Some Victorian mirrors were designed with hidden compartments behind a reflective surface. With careful hands, they removed the mirror once more from its wall mounting. Miss Marple examined the frame closely, her fingers probing the ornate carving until she felt a small, almost imperceptible catch near the base. When pressed, it released a mechanism that allowed the glass panel to be slid upward within the frame, revealing a shallow space behind. And there, wrapped in faded silk, lay a small leather-bound book, Emma Marchmont's diary, preserved for over a century in its hiding place behind the glass that reflected her face. Extraordinary, Mrs. Hargreaves breathed. To think it was there all along, waiting to be found. With reverent care, Margaret opened the diary, its pages crackling with age but the handwriting still clear and legible. Her account begins in early 1886, when she first met Sir George at a theatrical benefit in London, she said, scanning the early entries. Their relationship developed quickly. He pursued her quite ardently. They became intimate by summer. As Margaret turned the pages, Miss Marple noticed a change in her expression. "What is it? Have you found something significant?" "Yes, but not what I expected." Margaret looked up, her face troubled. According to these entries, Sir George was not the villain of the piece at all. He truly loved Emma and intended to leave his wife for her. They were secretly married in Paris in January 1887, as the documents show. But when they returned to England, separated for appearance's sake until the divorce could be arranged, someone else intervened. Who? Mrs. Hargreaves and Miss Marple asked simultaneously. Lady Hargreaves, Sir George's wife. The diary says she discovered their secret marriage and the pregnancy. She came to Thornfield House in April while Sir George was in London, confronting Emma and threatening to destroy both her and Sir George if the truth came out. Margaret turned another page. The final entry, dated April 18th, 1887, the day of Emma's death, says Lady Hargreaves was coming to Thornfield House again that evening, claiming to have a proposal that would resolve their situation without scandal. And instead, Miss Marple concluded grimly, she administered poison, laudanum, according to the historical records, and staged Emma's death to appear as a suicide. A murder disguised as suicide, Mrs. Hargreaves said softly. And the child was saved only through the quick thinking of Emma's loyal maid, who summoned a doctor immediately upon finding her mistress. The birth was kept secret, Margaret continued, reading from the diary's final pages, which contained notes apparently added by another hand, perhaps the maid's. The child was taken to Emma's French cousins and raised as their own, while Lady Hargreaves spread the story of Emma's suicide, painting her as a scorned mistress rather than a legally wedded wife. And Sir George? Miss Marple inquired. Did he never learn the truth? According to these notes, he died in a hunting accident just weeks after Emma's death, an accident arranged by Lady Hargreaves to protect her position and ensure her son would inherit everything. Her son being the direct ancestor of the current James Hargreaves, Miss Marple deduced, who it seems discovered or suspected the truth and was willing to kill to prevent it from coming to light. The sound of hurried footsteps in the hallway interrupted their discussion. Inspector Slack appeared in the doorway, his normally impassive face showing uncharacteristic agitation. James Hargreaves has been apprehended trying to board a ferry to France, he announced, and we found something in his rooms you should see. From his pocket, Slack produced a small glass vial and a sheaf of papers. Monkshood extract, he said, indicating the vial. And these appear to be notes on the Hargreaves family history, focusing specifically on the period after Emma Marchmont's death. He's been researching this for years, it seems. He must have suspected the truth, Mrs. Hargreaves said, and feared what might happen if it came to light. Especially when Mr. Carmichael discovered the marriage and birth records, Miss Marple added. And when Miss Blackwood overheard their conversation and became a potential witness. Inspector Slack nodded grimly. He's refused to make any statement so far, but the evidence is mounting. We've also found correspondence suggesting he had been making inquiries about the Victorian mirror for years before Mrs. Hargreaves acquired it. So his interest in the family history wasn't innocent curiosity, Margaret observed. He was trying to locate and suppress any evidence that might threaten his position as heir. A position that, legally, was never his to begin with, Miss Marple concluded quietly. How tragic that after all these years, Emma's mirror has finally revealed the truth she sought to preserve, though at such a cost. As the afternoon sun slanted through the drawing-room windows, casting long shadows across the floor, the Victorian mirror gleamed with quiet dignity in its place on the wall. To Miss Marple, it seemed that the subtle distortion in the glass had somehow cleared, as though the revelation of truth had restored its proper reflection. The whispers behind the mirror had finally been heard, and justice, long delayed, was at last being served. Chapter 6. The Forgotten Letter. The following morning dawned with a clarity that seemed to mirror the revelations of the previous day. Miss Marple, having slept surprisingly well despite the tumultuous events, made her way to Thornfield House, where Inspector Slack had arranged for all parties involved to gather. The drawing-room, scene of both historical tragedy and recent crimes, had been transformed into an impromptu conference room, with chairs arranged in a loose semicircle facing the Victorian mirror that had played such a pivotal role in the case. Present were Mrs. Hargreaves, looking pale but composed, Margaret Vance, her previous theatrical guise as Madame Valenska entirely abandoned, Miss Blackwood, released from the hospital but still somewhat frail, seated near a window, Dr. Haydock, who had been asked to attend in his medical capacity, and the vicar and his wife, whose connection to events was peripheral, but whose knowledge of local history might prove useful. "Thank you all for coming," Inspector Slack began, his normally brusque manner somewhat tempered by the gravity of the situation. "As you know, James Hargreaves is now in custody, charged with the murder of Richard Carmichael and the attempted murder of Miss Blackwood. The evidence against him is substantial, including the poison found in his possession, which matches the substance detected in both victims." "Has he confessed?" the vicar inquired. "Not explicitly," Slack replied, "but he's made several damaging statements during questioning. It appears he discovered the truth about Emma Marchmont's marriage to Sir George Hargreaves some years ago, through family papers in his father's possession. So he knew all along that his claim to the Hargreaves inheritance was fraudulent," Mrs. Hargreaves said, her voice tinged with betrayal. "Indeed," Slack confirmed, and when Mrs. Hargreaves began showing interest in acquiring Thornfield House and specifically the Victorian mirror associated with Emma Marchmont, he became alarmed. He feared that if the mirror contained evidence of the secret marriage, as it did, his position would be threatened. Miss Marple, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. "Which explains why he tried to persuade Mrs. Hargreaves to sell the mirror once it was installed at Thornfield House." "Exactly," Slack nodded. "According to his statement, he believed the diary might be hidden within the mirror frame, though he never had the opportunity to search it thoroughly himself." "But how did Mr. Carmichael become involved?" Miss Blackwood asked, her voice still weak but her mind evidently clear. "That was unfortunate coincidence," Slack explained. "Carmichael, in his capacity as an art dealer with expertise in provenance, was helping Mrs. Hargreaves acquire items for Thornfield House. During his research into the mirror's history, he stumbled upon references to Emma Marchmont's time in Paris and began investigating further. He was always fascinated by the human stories behind antiques," Mrs. Hargreaves recalled sadly. "He often said that objects carried the imprint of those who had owned them. His research led him to the British Embassy records in Paris," Slack continued, "where he discovered the marriage certificate and subsequent birth registration. Recognizing their significance to the Hargreaves inheritance, he contacted James to discuss his findings before revealing them to Mrs. Hargreaves. Not realizing," Miss Marple added, "that he was presenting this information to the very person with the most to lose if it became public." "Precisely," Slack agreed. James arranged to meet Carmichael before the dinner party, ostensibly to discuss the implications privately. Instead, he used the opportunity to introduce the monkshood poison, likely in a drink offered during their conversation. The vicar's wife gasped, "How dreadful, to kill a man simply to protect an inheritance." "The poison was cleverly chosen," Dr. Haydock observed. Econitum alkaloids can induce cardiac symptoms easily mistaken for natural heart failure, particularly in an older individual. Without specific testing, it might never have been detected. And with Mr. Carmichael's dramatic collapse occurring while he gazed into the supposedly haunted mirror, Miss Marple noted, it reinforced the local legend of Emma's curse, diverting attention from the true cause. "Indeed," Slack said. James admitted under questioning that he deliberately encouraged gossip about the mirror being haunted, hoping to dissuade Mrs. Hargreaves from keeping it. "And Miss Blackwood?" Margaret Vance prompted. "Why was she attacked?" Miss Blackwood answered for herself, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. "I overheard their conversation in the library. I didn't understand its full significance at the time, but when Mr. Carmichael died so suddenly, I began to wonder. I mentioned to James that I'd seen him in the glass house shortly before dinner, and I think he realized I might connect him to the poisonous plants growing there. So he attempted to silence you as well," Mrs. Hargreaves said, reaching over to pat Miss Blackwood's hand sympathetically. "Using the same poison, but administering it in tea rather than alcohol." "A smaller dose, Doctor," Haydock added, "which is why Miss Blackwood survived. The hallucinations she experienced, seeing a face in the mirror, were a typical effect of the toxin." Miss Blackwood looked uncertain. Was it only the poison then? The face seemed so real, so terribly sad and accusing. "The power of suggestion should never be underestimated," Dr. Haydock replied diplomatically. "Combined with a powerful hallucinogen and the story of Emma's ghost in that very room." Miss Marple, however, looked thoughtful. "Perhaps. Though sometimes I think there may be more ways for the dead to communicate with the living than our modern sensibilities are comfortable acknowledging." This comment was met with a moment of reflective silence, broken eventually by Inspector Slack returning to more tangible matters. "We've now established the means and opportunity for both crimes," he said, "and the motive is clear. James Hargreaves stood to lose his inheritance if the truth about Emma Marchmont's marriage came to light. What remains unclear is the extent of his knowledge about the historical events, specifically whether he knew that Emma was murdered rather than having committed suicide." "The diary makes that quite clear," Margaret said, gesturing to the small leather-bound volume that now lay on a side table, preserved in a protective covering provided by the police. "Emma was poisoned by Lady Hargreaves, Charlotte Hargreaves, Sir George's wife, who then staged the scene to appear as a suicide." "And Sir George himself?" the vicar inquired. "Did he suspect foul play in Emma's death?" "According to the additional notes in the diary, written presumably by Emma's maid," Miss Marple replied, "Sir George was devastated by the news of Emma's death. He initially accepted the suicide explanation, blaming himself for not having been more forthright about their marriage. But the maid apparently approached him with her suspicions just before his own untimely death." "The hunting accident," Mrs. Hargreaves murmured, "which the diary suggests was no accident at all."
"Lady Charlotte Hargreaves appears to have been a formidable and ruthless woman," the vicar observed, "to have arranged 2 deaths and successfully concealed a legitimate marriage and birth." "The stakes were extraordinarily high," Miss Marple pointed out. "If Emma's marriage to Sir George had become public knowledge and their child recognized as legitimate, Lady Charlotte would have lost everything: her social position, her wealth, her son's inheritance. In the Victorian era, a divorced woman was utterly ruined in society." "So she chose murder instead," Margaret said grimly, "and nearly succeeded in erasing Emma from history entirely, recasting her as a scorned mistress rather than a legal wife." "A deception that continued for generations," Mrs. Hargreaves added, "until circumstances, and perhaps Emma's own determination to have the truth known, finally brought it to light." As the discussion continued, Miss Marple noticed a constable approach Inspector Slack and murmur something in his ear. Slack's expression changed subtly, and he excused himself, returning moments later with an elderly woman who Miss Marple recognized as Miss Weatherby, the village librarian. "I apologize for the interruption," Slack announced, "but Miss Weatherby has brought something to our attention that may be relevant to our investigation." "I was cataloging some recently donated papers," Miss Weatherby explained, clutching a folder to her chest, "when I came across this letter. It was among the effects of the late Dr. Matthews, who served as physician in this area from 1880 to 1915. The letter was sealed and addressed to the authorities, to be opened in the event of suspicious circumstances surrounding my death. It's dated April 20th, 1887, 2 days after Emma Marchmont's death. A murmur of interest ran through the assembled group as Miss Weatherby carefully opened the folder and extracted a yellowed envelope. Given recent events and discussions about Emma Marchmont, I felt it should be brought to official attention immediately. Inspector Slack accepted the envelope with gloved hands, carefully removing the single sheet of paper inside. As he read, his expression grew increasingly grave. "This appears to be a letter written by Sir George Hargreaves himself," he announced. "It reads, 'I write this in great distress of mind and with fear for my own safety. 2 days ago, my beloved wife Emma was found dead at Thornfield House, our country home. Though the official finding has been suicide by laudanum, I have reason to believe she was murdered by my legal wife, Charlotte Hargreaves, who recently discovered our secret marriage performed in Paris this January. Emma was with child, our child, and had written to inform me she feared for her safety after a confrontation with Charlotte. I was detained in London on parliamentary business, a circumstance which I now believe was deliberately arranged by Charlotte to ensure my absence from Thornfield on the fatal day. Emma's maid, Mary Wilson, has come to me with disturbing observations from the night of Emma's death. She reports that Charlotte arrived at Thornfield unexpectedly, insisted on speaking privately with Emma, and departed hastily some hours later. When Mary entered the drawing room shortly thereafter, she found Emma unconscious, but still breathing. Though a doctor was summoned immediately, Emma succumbed before help arrived. Mary reports that the laudanum bottle found near Emma's body was not one Emma owned, and that certain papers appeared to have been disturbed in Emma's writing desk. Most significantly, Emma had confided in Mary that morning that she intended to make public our marriage and her condition, regardless of the scandal it might cause. I have confronted Charlotte with these concerns, and was met with such cold denial and veiled threats that I now fear for my own life as well. I have arranged for this letter to be held in confidence by Dr. Matthews, to be produced only if circumstances warrant after my death. Let it be known that Emma Marchmont was my true and lawful wife, our marriage having been performed at the British Embassy in Paris on January 12, 1887. Should our child survive, he or she is my legitimate heir, superseding any claims by Charlotte's son from our earlier marriage. George William Hargreaves. As Slack finished reading, a profound silence fell over the room. The letter, written over a century ago, had finally delivered Sir George's testimony from beyond the grave, confirming everything the diary had suggested about Emma's murder and the conspiracy to conceal the truth. He knew, Margaret said softly. He suspected Charlotte and tried to leave evidence that might eventually bring her to justice. And then met his own death in a hunting accident shortly thereafter, Mrs. Hargreaves added, just as the diary suggested. The child survived, Miss Marple reminded them. Though its existence was kept secret, Emma and Sir George's daughter lived to adulthood in France, continuing their bloodline. She smiled gently at Margaret. Through to the present day. Which makes the legal implications quite clear, Inspector Slack observed. This letter, combined with the marriage certificate and birth records, establishes a legitimate line of inheritance through Emma Marchmont and Sir George Hargreaves' child, a line that leads directly to Miss Vance here. Mrs. Hargreaves turned to Margaret with a thoughtful expression. It seems Thornfield House rightfully belongs to you, along with whatever remains of the Hargreaves estate. A rather unexpected development. I never came here seeking an inheritance, Margaret protested. Only the truth about my ancestor. Nevertheless, Mrs. Hargreaves replied, justice demands recognition of the facts, however belated. Though I must admit, I've grown rather attached to Thornfield House in the short time I've owned it. Perhaps, Miss Marple suggested gently, there might be a solution that honors both the legal truth and the genuine affection Mrs. Hargreaves has developed for the property. Margaret nodded slowly. I have no wish to displace you, Mrs. Hargreaves. After all, you're the one who saw out Emma's mirror and ultimately made it possible for her story to be told. Without your determination, the truth might never have come to light. As the two women began to discuss possibilities for sharing ownership of Thornfield House, Miss Marple found her attention drawn once again to the Victorian mirror. In the clear morning light, she could discern no distortion in its glass, no suggestion of anything beyond a simple reflection. Yet its silent presence had been instrumental in revealing truths long hidden, in bringing justice to those long dead, and in restoring a legacy almost lost to history. The forgotten letter, preserved by a conscientious doctor and discovered by chance at precisely the right moment, had provided the final piece of evidence needed to complete the picture, a picture that had begun to form when Miss Marple first observed the expression of terror on Richard Carmichael's face as he gazed into that ornate mirror from another era. As the meeting began to disperse, Inspector Slack approached Miss Marple with a rare expression of respect. "Your insights were invaluable in this case, Miss Marple. I might not have connected the historical events to the present-day crimes without your perspective." "Oh, I merely observed what was before me," Miss Marple demurred modestly. "Human nature changes very little over the centuries, you know. The same motives that drove Lady Charlotte Hargreaves to murder, greed, pride, fear of losing position, are still powerful forces today. James Hargreaves simply followed in his ancestors' footsteps, choosing deception and violence to protect what he saw as his rightful inheritance." "A pattern repeated across generations," Slack agreed, "until finally broken by the discovery of the truth." As Miss Marple prepared to leave Thornfield House, she paused once more before the Victorian mirror. For a moment, just a moment, she thought she glimpsed something in its depths. Not her own reflection, but the faint suggestion of a beautiful young woman's face, eyes no longer sad or accusing, but peaceful at last. A trick of the light, perhaps. Or perhaps, as Miss Marple had suggested earlier, there were indeed more ways for the dead to communicate with the living than modern sensibilities were comfortable acknowledging. Either way, the whispers behind the mirror had finally been heard, and the truth they had long guarded was now known to all. Chapter 7. Justice at Midnight. The days following the dramatic revelations at Thornfield House passed with relative calm, a welcome respite after the tumultuous events that had preceded them. Miss Marple had returned to her lodgings in the village, maintaining a discreet distance as the legal implications of the case began to unfold. James Hargreaves remained in custody, having been formally charged with the murder of Richard Carmichael and the attempted murder of Letitia Blackwood, while solicitors for both Mrs. Hargreaves and Margaret Vance conferred over the complicated matter of inheritance rights stemming from events more than a century old. Miss Marple was taking tea in the garden of her lodgings when she received an unexpected visit from Dr. Haydock, who accepted her offer of tea with evident appreciation. "I thought you might like to know," he said, after they had exchanged pleasantries, "that Miss Blackwood continues to improve. The last traces of the poison have cleared her system, and she's regaining her strength admirably." "I'm very glad to hear it," Miss Marple replied. "She struck me as a resilient sort, despite her rather nervous demeanor." "Indeed, though she remains troubled by what she experienced, or believes she experienced, while under the influence of the monkshood. She insists that what she saw in the mirror was not merely a hallucination." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened with interest. "Oh? And what does she say now about that experience?" "She claims that the face she saw, the woman's face superimposed over her own reflection, conveyed specific information to her. Not just the cryptic statement she mentioned earlier about, 'he knows where it is hidden,' but something more detailed." Dr. Haydock hesitated. "She says the face, Emma's face, she believes, told her that the diary is not all. There is more evidence hidden where the light catches glass at midnight. Only then is the full truth revealed." "How very specific," Miss Marple murmured. "And did she share this information with Inspector Slack?" "She did, though I rather think he dismissed it as the lingering effects of the poison. From a strictly medical perspective, I'm inclined to agree. And yet," Dr. Haydock's expression grew thoughtful, "there have been cases documented in medical literature of patients under extreme stress or the influence of certain substances perceiving things that later proved to have some basis in reality." "The mind is a mysterious instrument," Miss Marple agreed, "and perception can operate in ways science has yet to fully explain." After Dr. Haydock's departure, Miss Marple sat quietly contemplating what she had learned. The specific reference to midnight and light upon glass suggested something beyond mere hallucination, something that might indeed reveal further evidence in the case. That evening, she received a telephone call from Mrs. Hargreaves, inviting her to return to Thornfield House. "Margaret and I have reached an agreement about the property," Mrs. Hargreaves explained, and we'd very much like you to be present when we formalize the arrangement. Could you join us tomorrow afternoon? I'd be delighted, Miss Marple replied. After a moment's consideration, she added, Has Miss Blackwood mentioned anything to you about what she believes she saw in the mirror? Specifically, a message about evidence hidden where the light catches glass at midnight. There was a pause on the line. Why, yes, she did mention something of the sort when she visited today. I confess I didn't pay it much mind, assuming it was related to her ordeal. Do you think it's significant? Perhaps. Would you object if I were to arrive at Thornfield House a bit earlier than our appointment, say, around 11 tonight? There's something I'd like to observe in the drawing room. Though clearly puzzled, Mrs. Hargreaves agreed, and so it was that Miss Marple found herself entering Thornfield House shortly before midnight, accompanied by a curious but cooperative Mrs. Hargreaves and Margaret Vance, who had been staying as a guest since the revelations about her lineage. I'm not entirely sure what we're looking for, Miss Marple admitted, as they entered the drawing room, which was illuminated only by a single lamp. But Miss Blackwood's experience suggested that something might be revealed by the particular way light falls upon the mirror at midnight. Rather melodramatic, Mrs. Hargreaves commented, though her tone was more intrigued than dismissive. Though I suppose Emma might have had a theatrical flair, given her profession. It would be consistent with her character, Margaret agreed. My family stories portray her as having quite a vivid imagination. They positioned themselves where they could observe the Victorian mirror, which still dominated the wall opposite the windows. As the clock in the hall began to strike 12, a curious phenomenon occurred. The moonlight, streaming through a gap in the curtains, struck the mirror at a particular angle, causing a reflection to bounce onto the ornate ceiling rose above the chandelier. Within that reflection, a subtle pattern became visible, what appeared to be a sequence of letters and numbers. Extraordinary, breathed Mrs. Hargreaves, staring upward. I've never noticed that before. The angle of light would only create that reflection at certain times, Miss Marple observed, and perhaps only when the moon is in a particular phase or position. Margaret had already fetched a small notebook and was copying down the sequence, EM188731-5W. A code of some kind? Mrs. Hargreaves suggested. Or coordinates, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. The letters could be initials, Emma Marchmont, followed by the year, 1887, and then, she paused, considering, perhaps a significant date, March 15th, and W for West. Or it could be a reference to something within the house itself, Margaret suggested. Room numbers, measurements, or a location on the grounds. Mrs. Hargreaves suddenly straightened. Wait, the old library system. When Emma owned Thornfield House, the library used a cataloguing system based on sections and shelf numbers. My renovations preserved the original shelving, though I've rearranged the books themselves. With growing excitement, they moved to the library, where Mrs. Hargreaves examined the shelving. Here, Section 3, Shelf 1, Position 5, in the western corner of the room. The book in that position was a leather-bound collection of Shakespeare's works, its spine cracked with age. When Mrs. Hargreaves carefully removed it from the shelf, they discovered a small compartment hollowed out behind it, containing a sealed envelope that had clearly lain undisturbed for decades. With hands that trembled slightly, Mrs. Hargreaves withdrew the envelope. It was addressed simply, "To be found when the truth is known." Inside was a letter written in a firm, masculine hand, dated April 19th, 1887, the day after Emma Marchmont's death, and one day before Sir George Hargreaves wrote the letter that Miss Weatherby had discovered. It's from Sir George, Mrs. Hargreaves confirmed, scanning the contents. Addressed to Emma, though he must have known she would never read it. She began to read aloud, "My dearest Emma, though you are beyond the reach of these words, I write them as a testament to the truth, and in the hope that someday they may serve as evidence of the great wrong that has been done to you. I have just returned from Thornfield House, where I was met with the devastating news of your death. Charlotte's performance of grief was convincing to all but me, who saw the cold satisfaction behind her eyes when she informed me that you had taken your own life, unable to bear the shame of our illicit relationship. What she does not know is that your faithful Mary came to me privately and revealed what she witnessed, Charlotte arriving at Thornfield, insisting on speaking with you alone, and departing hastily some hours later. Mary found you unconscious and summoned help immediately, but it was too late. The doctor, not knowing the full circumstances, accepted the narrative of suicide that Charlotte had already begun to construct. Mary also told me of your condition, our child, and that through the doctor's swift intervention after your death, the infant lives, though barely. She has taken the child to your cousins in France, as we had discussed might be necessary if the worst should happen. I write this now in great turmoil, torn between grief for you and fear for our child. I have confronted Charlotte with my suspicions, which she denied with such calculated vehemence that I am now convinced of her guilt. She reminded me, with ice in her voice, of how tragic it would be if a second death were to occur so soon after yours, a veiled threat I cannot ignore. I have taken precautions. I have written to our solicitor in London, enclosing copies of our marriage certificate and details of the birth, though I dare not be explicit about my suspicions regarding your death. I have also left a sealed letter with Dr. Matthews, to be opened only in the event of my own sudden demise, and I place this letter here, in the system we devised for our private communications, marked in the way only we would understand. Perhaps someday, when Charlotte's power to harm has ended, the truth will be discovered. Know that I loved you truly, my Emma, and that I will seek justice for you as long as there is breath in my body. If I fail, perhaps time will succeed where I could not. Forever yours, George. Silence fell as Mrs. Hargreaves finished reading. The letter, written in anguish more than a century ago, filled the room with an almost palpable sense of the past reaching forward to touch the present. He knew, Margaret said softly. He suspected Charlotte immediately, even as she was constructing the suicide narrative. And he feared for his own life as well, Miss Marple added. With good reason, it seems, given his untimely death shortly afterward. But he left evidence in multiple places, Mrs. Hargreaves observed. The letter with Dr. Matthews, instructions to his solicitor, and this letter hidden where only someone who knew their private code would find it. A precaution that proved wise, Miss Marple said, though it took far longer than he might have imagined for the full truth to emerge. The discovery of Sir George's hidden letter added another layer of confirmation to what they had already learned through Emma's diary and the previously discovered letter. It painted a clear picture of a calculated murder committed to preserve social position and inheritance, followed by a second murder to silence the one person who suspected the truth. This should be shown to Inspector Slack, Miss Marple suggested. Though it relates to crimes committed long ago, it provides important context for the current case against James Hargreaves. Yes, Mrs. Hargreaves agreed. It establishes a pattern of deception and violence spanning generations of the family. A pattern James continued when he felt his position threatened, just as his ancestor Charlotte did. The following afternoon, as planned, they gathered in the drawing room of Thornfield House. Miss Marple, Mrs. Hargreaves, Margaret Vance, Miss Blackwood, now recovered enough to join them, Inspector Slack, and the solicitors representing the various parties. Before we proceed with the legal matters, Mrs. Hargreaves began. There's something we should all be aware of. She explained their midnight discovery and produced Sir George's letter, which Slack read with professional interest. Remarkable, he commented. 3 separate pieces of evidence hidden by Sir George Hargreaves, all confirming the same sequence of events. The case against Lady Charlotte would have been quite strong, had these been discovered in her lifetime. Justice delayed is not always justice denied, Miss Marple observed quietly. The truth has emerged, even after all these years. Indeed, Slack agreed, and it provides valuable context for our current case. James Hargreaves's actions appear to have been motivated by the same concern that drove his ancestor, protecting an inheritance that was in fact founded on deception and murder. With that somber reflection, they turned to the legal matters at hand. The solicitors had prepared documents formalizing the agreement reached between Mrs. Hargreaves and Margaret Vance. Margaret would be recognized as the legitimate heir to the Hargreaves estate through her descent from Emma and Sir George, for mensam and what was a V, while Mrs. Hargreaves would retain lifetime residency rights at Thornfield House. The property would ultimately pass to a trust established to preserve both the historical record of Emma Marchmont and the architectural heritage of the house itself. A most equitable arrangement, Miss Marple commented as the documents were signed, and one that honors the wishes Sir George expressed in his letters, that the truth should be known and his child's rights recognized. It feels right, Margaret agreed. I never sought financial gain from this discovery, only to clear Emma's name and establish the truth of her relationship with Sir George. And in doing so, you've helped bring a murderer to justice in our own time, Inspector Slack pointed out. James Hargreaves might never have been discovered if not for this investigation into the past. As the meeting concluded and the participants began to disperse, Miss Blackwood approached Miss Marple somewhat hesitantly. Miss Marple, I wanted to thank you for taking my experience seriously. The doctors were convinced it was merely hallucination induced by the poison, but you understood there might be more to it. The mind is a complex instrument, Miss Marple replied, and sometimes it perceives things that cannot be easily explained by conventional understanding. Whether what you saw was Emma's spirit, or some subconscious recognition of a pattern you'd observed without realizing it, the moonlight reflection occurring at midnight perhaps, the result was the discovery of important evidence. You're very kind, Miss Blackwood said, though I'm still not entirely convinced it was purely psychological. There was something in that face, a profound sadness, but also a determination, as though she had been waiting a very long time for someone to hear her story. Well, her story has certainly been heard now, Miss Marple said gently, and perhaps that's what matters most in the end. Later, as the afternoon shadows lengthened across the lawns of Thornfield House, Miss Marple found herself alone in the drawing room, standing before the Victorian mirror that had been at the centre of so many dramatic events. Its surface reflected the room with perfect clarity now, showing nothing but what stood before it. And yet, Miss Marple reflected, this ordinary object had managed to preserve extraordinary truths across more than a century. Emma's diary, hidden behind its glass, Sir George's coded message visible only in its reflection at a particular moment, the letter concealed where that reflection pointed, layers of evidence patiently waiting to be discovered. Justice had finally been served, not only for Emma Marchmont and Sir George Hargreaves, but also for Richard Carmichael, whose murder might never have been recognized as such without the investigation into the historical events. The pattern of deception that had persisted through generations of the Hargreaves family had finally been broken. The whispers behind the mirror finally heard. As Miss Marple turned to leave, she could have sworn she caught a glimpse of something in the mirror's depths. Not a face, but a subtle shift in the quality of light, as though a shadow had lifted. But when she looked directly at the glass again, she saw only her own reflection, elderly and composed, with the quiet satisfaction of a mystery solved and justice, however delayed, finally achieved. Chapter 8. The Patterns of Justice. A fortnight had passed since the dramatic revelations at Thornfield House. The village of St. Edith's Marsh had gradually returned to its usual peaceful rhythm, though the extraordinary events continued to provide ample material for conversation at the local shops and tea rooms. Miss Marple, preparing to return to her cottage in St. Mary Mead, was taking tea with Mrs. Hargreaves in the garden of Thornfield House, enjoying the late afternoon sunshine and the brilliant display of roses that Jenkins the gardener had cultivated with such care. You must promise to visit again, Jane, Mrs. Hargreaves said, pouring a second cup of tea. Perhaps in the autumn, when the renovations to the east wing are complete. Margaret has the most wonderful ideas for transforming it into a small museum dedicated to Emma's theatrical career. That sounds most interesting, Miss Marple replied. I should very much like to see it. And how is Miss Blackwood settling into her new role? Following the resolution of the case, Letitia Blackwood had been appointed curator of the nascent Marchmont collection. Her natural organizational abilities and genuine interest in the historical materials making her ideally suited for the position. Splendidly, Mrs. Hargreaves smiled. She's cataloguing Emma's papers and correspondence with remarkable efficiency, and the diary, of course, is the centerpiece of the collection, though we've had to place it in a specialized display case to protect it from further deterioration. And the mirror? Miss Marple inquired, glancing toward the house. Will it remain in the drawing room? For now, yes, though eventually it will join the museum collection. It seems only fitting, given its central role in preserving Emma's story. Mrs. Hargreaves hesitated, then added, The most curious thing happened yesterday. A specialist from London came to examine it, an expert in Victorian decorative arts. He confirmed it was indeed made by a particular craftsman known to have created mirrors for theatrical figures of the period. But he also discovered something we had all overlooked. Oh! Miss Marple's interest was immediately piqued. The distortion in the glass, the subtle flaw we had all noticed. He determined it wasn't a flaw at all, but a deliberate optical effect created by the glassmaker. When light strikes it at certain angles, it creates a particular pattern of reflection. Mrs. Hargreaves leaned forward slightly. He believes it was designed specifically to reveal the coded message we discovered only by chance that night. The entire mirror was a clever puzzle box, created to conceal information while providing the means to reveal it to anyone who knew the secret. How very ingenious, Miss Marple remarked, and how appropriate that it should have been designed for an actress, someone accustomed to revealing truth through performance. Indeed. The specialist was quite excited by the discovery. Apparently such mechanism mirrors are extremely rare. This one may be unique in its complexity. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Slack, who had telephoned earlier to request a brief meeting before Miss Marple's departure from the area. "Good afternoon, ladies," he greeted them with uncharacteristic geniality. "I hope I'm not intruding, but I thought you'd want to know the latest developments in the case." "Not at all, Inspector," Mrs. Hargreaves assured him. "Please, join us. More tea?" Slack accepted a cup with thanks, settling into a garden chair with a creak of official dignity. "James Hargreaves has entered a plea," he announced without preamble. "Guilty to both charges, the murder of Richard Carmichael and the attempted murder of Miss Blackwood." "I'm somewhat surprised," Miss Marple admitted. "I had expected him to maintain his innocence, given his previously steadfast denials." "As did we," Slack agreed. "But it seems the weight of evidence finally convinced him, or more likely his legal advisors, that fighting the charges would only prolong the inevitable, particularly after forensic analysis confirmed the monkshood extract found in his possession matched exactly what was found in both victims." "Has he made any statement about his motives?" Mrs. Hargreaves inquired. "A full confession, in fact." Slack extracted a small notebook from his pocket. According to his statement, he discovered the truth about Emma Marchmont's marriage to Sir George Hargreaves some years ago, while examining family papers after his father's death. Among those papers was a letter from Lady Charlotte Hargreaves to her son, James's great-grandfather, warning him that certain documents might exist that could threaten their position. "So the deception was known and deliberately maintained through generations," Miss Marple observed. "Precisely. When Mrs. Hargreaves began showing interest in acquiring Thornfield House, and specifically sought out the Victorian mirror associated with Emma, James became alarmed. He feared that if evidence of the marriage had been preserved, as Lady Charlotte had warned, it might well be hidden within or connected to the mirror." "Which indeed it was," Mrs. Hargreaves noted. "Yes. James admits he tried various strategies to prevent the mirror from remaining at Thornfield House, first attempting to dissuade you from purchasing it, then encouraging you to sell it after it was installed, and finally resorting to reinforcing the local superstitions about it being haunted or cursed. All to protect his inheritance," Miss Marple said quietly. "An inheritance he knew was founded on a historical fraud," Slack confirmed. When Richard Carmichael contacted him privately to discuss the documents he had discovered in France, the marriage certificate and birth records, James realized his position was in imminent danger. He arranged to meet Carmichael before the dinner party, ostensibly to discuss the implications, but actually to administer the poison he had prepared from plants in the Thornfield glasshouse. And Miss Blackwood became his second victim when she inadvertently revealed she had overheard that conversation, Mrs. Hargreaves added. "Exactly. Though fortunately for her, he was more rushed in that attempt and administered a non-lethal dose." Slack closed his notebook with a snap. "The judge will likely take into account his eventual cooperation, but given the premeditated nature of the crimes and the evidence of careful planning, he's facing a substantial sentence." "As he should," Mrs. Hargreaves said firmly. "2 lives destroyed, 1 ended, 1 nearly so, all to protect what was never rightfully his to begin with. It's almost a repetition of what his ancestor Charlotte did, isn't it? The same pattern of deception and violence, over a century later." "Human nature changes very little across the generations," Miss Marple observed. "The same motives that drove Lady Charlotte, fear of losing position, resentment of a perceived interloper, determination to protect an inheritance, drove James to similar actions in our own time." After Inspector Slack's departure, Borchers, Mrs. Hargreaves and Miss Marple were joined by Margaret Vance, who had been overseeing the cataloguing of some newly discovered correspondence related to Emma's theatrical career. I've been thinking, Margaret said, as she accepted a cup of tea, about that phrase from the letter we found, where the light catches glass at midnight. It seems Emma and Sir George had developed quite an elaborate system of private communication. Not surprising, given the circumstances of their relationship, Miss Marple replied. They would have needed ways to exchange information without arousing suspicion. Yes, but it's more than that. The diary mentions several other coded messages and hidden caches of letters. I can't help wondering if there might be more we haven't yet discovered, more pieces of their story still concealed somewhere in this house or elsewhere. It's certainly possible, Mrs. Hargreaves acknowledged. Thornfield House has yielded its secret slowly, one layer at a time. Who knows what else might be revealed with continued careful investigation? A project for the future, perhaps, Miss Marple suggested. Though I think the essential truth of what happened to Emma and Sir George is now well established. Thanks in no small part to you, Jane, Mrs. Hargreaves said warmly. Without your insights and your willingness to take seriously what others dismissed as superstition or coincidence, we might never have connected the historical events to the present-day crimes. Miss Marple demurred modestly. I merely observed what was before me. The patterns of human behavior are remarkably consistent, you know. Once one recognizes those patterns, the connections become quite clear. As the afternoon began to fade toward evening, Miss Marple took her leave of Thornfield House. Margaret insisted on driving her back to her lodgings in the village, where her packed cases awaited transport to the railway station the following morning. I'm curious, Margaret said, as they drove along the winding country road. Do you believe there was some supernatural element to all of this? The face Miss Blackwood claimed to see in the mirror, the strange timing of discoveries, the way Emma's story seemed determined to emerge after so many years of suppression. Miss Marple considered the question thoughtfully. I believe that strong emotions, love, injustice, the desire for truth to be known, can sometimes leave impressions that endure beyond what we might rationally expect. Whether those impressions manifest through what we call supernatural means, or simply through the chain of human actions and reactions, is perhaps less important than the fact that they persist at all. So you do think Emma's spirit might have been involved in bringing the truth to light? Margaret pressed. I think, Miss Marple replied carefully, that Emma Marchmont was a woman of remarkable determination, who took extraordinary measures in life to preserve the truth of her relationship with Sir George. The diary hidden in the mirror, the coded message visible only at a specific time, these were physical provisions she made while alive. If something of that determination persisted after her death, manifesting in ways we might call supernatural, well, I wouldn't necessarily dismiss the possibility. Margaret nodded, seemingly satisfied with this measured response. That evening, settled in her room with her knitting, Miss Marple reflected on the case that had begun with the sudden death of Richard Carmichael as he gazed into an ornate Victorian mirror. The intricate web of connections between past and present, the parallel patterns of deception spanning generations, the careful preservation of evidence designed to eventually reveal the truth, all these elements had combined to create a mystery as complex as it was ultimately satisfying to unravel. The Victorian mirror, with its subtle distortion and hidden compartments, had served as both the repository of secrets and the means by which those secrets could eventually be discovered. Like the best puzzles, it contained within itself both the mystery and the solution, requiring only the right observer at the right moment to bring its truths to light. Miss Marple was reminded of something her dear friend Mrs. Bantry had once said about old houses and old families. The past leaves fingerprints, Jane, if one knows how to see them. In this case, those fingerprints had been carefully and deliberately left by Emma Marchmont and Sir George Hargreaves, preserved through the decades until circumstances finally aligned to make them visible. Justice, so long delayed, had finally been achieved, not only for Emma and Sir George, whose true relationship and legal marriage had at last been acknowledged, but also for Richard Carmichael, whose murder might never have been recognized as such without the investigation into historical events. Even James Hargreaves, facing the consequences of his actions, represented a form of justice for the long-ago crimes of his ancestor, Lady Charlotte. The following morning, as Miss Marple boarded the train that would return her to St. Mary Mead, she caught sight of Thornfield House on its distant hillside, the morning sun glinting off its windows. For a moment, she fancied she could see the Victorian mirror in the drawing room. its glass no longer distorted by secrets kept too long, now reflecting only clear and simple truth. The whispers behind the mirror had been heard at last, their message finally delivered after more than a century of patient waiting. And in that delivery, a pattern of deception that had persisted across generations had finally been broken, replaced by a new pattern, one of truth acknowledged, justice served, and lives reclaimed from the shadows of the past. As the train pulled away from the station, Miss Marple opened her knitting bag and extracted the complex pattern she had been working on throughout her stay. A delicate lace design of interconnected motifs that, when viewed from a distance, revealed a larger, harmonious whole. Rather like the case itself, she reflected with satisfaction. Individual threads that, when properly understood and connected, formed a complete and meaningful picture. She would have quite a story to tell her friends back in St. Mary Mead, though of course, as always, she would focus on the human elements of the case, the reliable patterns of behavior that, once recognized, made even the most complex mystery ultimately comprehensible. For in Miss Marple's experienced view, no matter how elaborate the setting or how unusual the circumstances, human nature remained fundamentally consistent. One needed only to observe it with sufficient attention and understanding to see the truth behind whatever masks it might wear. And in that understanding lay the key to both justice and wisdom, a quietly profound lesson that Miss Jane Marple had learned through a lifetime of keen observation in St. Mary Mead and beyond.